王家火烧阳拉张杂罗，更个露珠真你真的你的能达到色味，真你当个只上首先你记得个了。当到这边做了马路们动我的节色的问，都做个拉不就他这样了这样的。如得接着你毛你老理解着着中在家马路么些等人，今年正在那这闹，多年大家十几的所有的来做这这都，知道这你见这道路么些人家伙那样懒得的，马拉巴扎那都马拉巴扎那都马拉巴扎那都马拉巴扎那都马拉巴扎那。Marabazana, the Marabazana, the Marabazana, the Marabazana, the Marabazana, the Marabazana, the Marabazana, the Marabazana. Umarabazana, the Marabazana, the Marabazana, the Marabazana, the Marabazana, the Marabazana, the Marabazana, the Marabazana. Umarabazana, the Children Jin General was a regime, the Lord the Mambaravsa. 我当当就上了到八一路主我边那瓦接的是了，娘家进步做的你们让做那帮进步那家的，把个人当俺咱都什么，东巴的街将了上za儿喽。好，各位大家下午好。
Good afternoon to everyone.
今天我们有多少个人讲韩语的？
How many people today do we have who understand Chinese?
哦，好，好，我们今天我们现在准备讲这个今天下午的课。
So we are ready now to begin with this afternoon's teaching.
今天下午的课是课的这个内容是如何把痛苦转为这个快乐日常生活当中如何把不开心烦恼痛苦转化为开心。
The topic of this afternoon's teaching is how to, in our everyday lives, go about transforming suffering into happiness.
我们今天为什么要讲一个这样子的课呢？因为我们每一个人的这个心里就有各种各样的烦恼。
The reason that we are talking about this subject this afternoon is because everyone in their minds has all kinds of afflictions.
很多的烦恼它本身是我们每一个人都有一些先天的烦恼。
Everyone has some kind of inherent afflictions.
然后呢，多数的烦恼呢，就是因为我们的，比如说家庭工作、生活，给我们带来的各种各样的烦恼。
And the majority of our afflictions, you might say, or vexations in life derive from our life in general, our work lives, our family lives.
首先，我们可以这样子讲。首先，我们作为一个人那么人是什么呢？人是什么东西构造的人的一部分是物质，就是我们的这个身体然后呢，人的另外的一部分是精神所以人是物质和精神组成的这样子。
The first thing that we have to establish is how a human being is comprised, what a human being is made up of. And we can say that humans are comprised of a material component and a spiritual component, or the mind. So we are constituted by these two elements.
因为人是这个物质和精神组成的，所以人 就有2种不同的需求，一个是物质的需求，也就是我们的身体的需求，另外一个是精神方面的需求，人就有2个不同的需求。
So because we're comprised of these 2 different elements, we as humans have needs that correspond to each of them. So as humans we have needs that are material in nature and also needs that are spiritual in nature or that pertain to our minds.
因为人有2种不同的需求，所以我们有2种不同的生活，一个叫做物质生活另外一个就叫做精神生活。
So on account of us having these 2 different kinds of needs, we can speak about ourselves having 2 kinds of life. We have material lives, or lives that are oriented to material fulfillment, and lives that are oriented to spiritual fulfillment.
那么这2个不同的这个生活当中，任何一个生活当中就是不能给我们提供满足满意的东西，比如说物质的这个生活当中缺乏了一些东西的时候呢，然后我们的身体开始不舒服，甚至会痛苦。同样的我们的精神的这个生活当中也缺乏了一些东西的时候我们的精神生活不能满足我们的这个精神这样子的时候呢，然后同样我们的精神就会烦恼不开心甚至是痛苦。
So in respect of these 2 different aspects that we have and the 2 different lives that correspond with them, if we are lacking, if we fail to fulfill our needs with respect to either, then we feel unsatisfied. So insofar as our material lives or our material aspect is concerned, if we are not able to satisfy our needs, then our bodies feel uncomfortable. Perhaps even we experience some kind of physical pain or suffering. And the same goes for our spiritual lives as well. When they are not able to fulfill our spiritual needs fully, then we become unsatisfied. We experience vexation, unhappiness, and potentially suffering.
然后这2个不同的这个生活，2个不同的生活当中，比如说物质生活当中缺乏了一些基本的这个东西的时候呢这个就叫做贫穷我们会讲这就是贫穷但是同样的我们的精神生活精神生活当中缺乏了一些东西的时候呢，同样的也叫做贫穷这2个都叫做贫穷。
So when we lack certain needs in our material lives, we refer to that state as one of poverty. And actually we can say the same for our spiritual lives as well. When we are lacking necessary things in terms of our spiritual needs, then we can describe ourselves as being in a state of poverty. So in respect of both the spiritual and the material, we can talk about an inability to fulfill our needs as a state of poverty.
可是我们人是什么样子？我们绝大多数的人就觉得贫穷就是我们的物质生活不能满足我们的这个需求缺乏一些基本的这些需要的东西的时候呢，我们大家都认为这个是贫穷但是我们精神生活方面就是缺乏一些东西的时候呢，我们还没有感觉到这个叫做贫穷平时我们不认为这个是贫穷，但是实际上这2个都叫做贫穷。
So most people would readily perceive a lack of material things in their life as poverty, but still a lot of people wouldn't recognize or identify a lack of spiritual things or a failure to fulfill their spiritual needs as poverty. But in actual fact, we should consider these both equally as forms of poverty.
那我们为什么这个物质生活缺乏的时候，我们认为是贫穷啊？为什么精神生活当中缺乏一些东西的时候，我们为什么不认为这个是贫穷呢？就是因为我们特别的看重物质看重了物质，然后呢，我们把这个精神方面的很多东西忽略了所以我们认为精神上缺乏了很多东西，但是我们不认为这个是贫穷，我们也不叫它贫穷。然后物质方面缺乏东西的时候呢，然后我们认为这个是贫穷，我们也叫它贫穷那么原因就是我们特别的看重物质，忽略了这个精神就是这个原因。
So why is it that when we experience material lack that we are willing to call ourselves poor, but not so in a situation of spiritual lack? The reason for this is that we place an extreme emphasis on our material lives, on material things, and we neglect matters of the spirit, we neglect our spiritual lives. So as a result, when we do experience spiritual lack, we don't identify this as poverty, but we do when we have some kind of material lacking. And this is because of the undue emphasis that we place on the material aspect of our lives.
那么这个价值观这个是我们的价值观，这个价值观的结果它的结果是什么呢？现在绝大多数的人物质已经有了很多的物质但是呢精神方面空虚浮躁，然后就是烦恼甚至是痛苦得不到这个解决不了这个精神上的这个问题那么这是它的这个结果。
So this particular priority of values that we have carries the result of us being in a situation where we possess a lot of material things, we have a lot of material belongings, etc. But in terms of our spiritual lives, we often find ourselves empty, perturbed, agitated, and suffering. This is the direct result of the values that we hold.
然后这个结果就是因为这个我们没有控制好，没有这个关注我们的这个精神的问题，然后最后就是导致了很多的人虽然有很多的物质比如说我们这个比如说像夏威夷这么漂亮的这个风景到处都是风景，到处都是美景很多人觉得在这个地方人在这个地方生活，很多人觉得应该是很幸福的。但是我想可能不是这样子的因为在这个地方生活的人，他也有他们的各种各样的这个内心的这个痛苦内心的这个问题全世界所有人都有的。那么这个问题没有解决了以后呢，逐渐的最后我们这个很多人的精神最后就是变得不健康比如说有这个抑郁症然后就是焦虑症等等的这个精神上的疾病就越来越多了。
So if we don't exercise control over our spiritual lives, then this tends to be the result. We can be in a situation where we own lots of material things or enjoy a very rich material life. For example, in Hawaii, many people, I'm sure, believe that everyone who lives in Hawaii must be extremely happy. Everywhere one looks, one is surrounded by beautiful scenery. There's so much beauty everywhere. But I would say that even though many people think that to live here one must automatically be happy. It's probably not the case. People here, like people everywhere, no doubt experience their own inner suffering. Everyone all around the world is the same in this regard. In any case, in terms of our inner suffering, if we don't address it, if we don't solve it, then people's minds become increasingly unhealthy and may develop conditions such as depression or anxiety, and in general, mental health tends to increase in this kind of situation.
这个外面的物质，能不能给我们带来这个幸福感啊？这个取决于我们的心态也就是说，这个不是物质本身来决定，而是我们的心态来决定外面的物质能给我们带来幸福，那这样子的话，必须要有很好的心情好的心态，这样子外面的物质才能够给我们带来幸福。
So is the external world able to deliver us happiness? Well, as to whether or not it is, as to whether or not the external material world is able to give us happiness, it depends really on the state of our mind, our attitude. It's whether or not we can derive happiness from the material world isn't determined by the material world itself, but our attitude or our mood.
如果我们的这个心态没有调整好心情不好这样子的时候呢，然后呢外面的环境再优美然后我们拥有的这个物质再丰富都不能幸福。
If we haven't been able to properly adjust our state of minds, then regardless of how beautiful the surrounding scenery might be or how rich and plentiful our material lives may be, we still won't experience happiness.
那么这样子的话，我们刚才讲了就是我们有两个这个生活，一个是物质生活，另外一个是精神生活那么物质生活当中我们需要什么，我们大家都很清楚。比如说我口渴的时候呢，我们知道我要喝水我肚子饿的时候呢，我们知道我要吃东西然后呢我需要这个呼吸，需要空气水、食物、空气我们大家都知道我需要这些了但是精神上面需要什么呢？我们很多人不太清楚到底需要什么。
So returning to this idea of us having material lives and spiritual lives, in terms of the first one, our material lives, we're generally very clear as to what our needs are and how we should go about addressing them. So, for example, we're very clear about the fact that if we experience thirst, we should drink water. If we're hungry, we should eat food. So we're really clear about things such as the necessity of air, water, food, etc. However, in terms of our spiritual lives, many people are not clear about their needs and how they should go about addressing them.
我们大家想想我们的精神生活里面需要什么有什么东西在精神生活当中给我们带来幸福就是你们就回答一下，请问大家我们的精神生活当中应该有什么需要什么
？I'd be really interested to hear from some of you what you think our spiritual lives need, what our spiritual lives should be equipped with. If anybody has any ideas.
Feel that you have to have meaning and purpose in your life in order to have a sense.
一定要有目标，要有意义，才能活得有成就感。
哎呀，目标，还有呢？
A way to
a way to happiness. 找到真正快乐的一个道路。对自己和其他人的慈悲。
慈悲，啊。
就也就是轮回的一个概念，就是说下一辈子，就是对轮回下一世的一个相信。
啊，少欲知足啊，少欲知足，还有呢？
一个能够接受现实的能力和接受变化的能力。
Very good. Yeah. Meditation. Wow. Yeah. Yeah.
Feeling of interconnectedness.
就是一种和其他人和其他事物之间的一个怎么说嘛？有联系感。
有什么？
有一种联系感。就是说你和其他人，他我之间的一个你我之间的，和人和其他的这个怎么说嘛？联系。
好，联系是吧？还有呢？
这个就是和大自然联系的很深。
啊，好，差不多了啊，大家回答得非常非常好。
Thank you for your very good answers.
好，那么我们现在就是要讲一讲，比如说我们每一天生活当中，当我们遇到这个不开心然后呢烦恼、痛苦这样子的时候我们怎么样去解决这个问题接下来我们从佛教的角度先给大家这个介绍一下这个方法。
So from here, I'd like to move on to talking about how we go about addressing matters when we encounter suffering or vexation in our lives. And I would like to provide an introduction as to a method we can use from a Buddhist perspective.
然后我们人的这个人类的基本的这个痛苦基本的痛苦是佛教里面就讲生老病死四个痛苦。
So, according to Buddhism, the basic or fundamental suffering in human life is described as being the suffering of birth, aging, sickness, and death.
那么这个四个痛苦当中呢生我们每一个人都已经诞生了那么这个痛不痛苦我们现在很多人也记不得了但是其他的三个另外的这个三个呢我们每一个人一定要面对的。
So as to the first kind of suffering, the suffering associated with birth, well, all of us have already arisen, and most of us don't really remember the suffering associated with that. However, the other three types of suffering, the suffering associated with aging and sickness and death, are ones that we will inevitably encounter.
除了这个四个痛苦以外，还有另外的这个四个痛苦。
And besides these 4 forms of suffering, there's another 4 forms of suffering.
比如说，我想要的东西得不到啊，这个我们平时我们的生活当中很多时候都有，这就是一个痛苦。
So the first kind would be when we are not able to attain the things that we want to attain.
然后我不想拥有的东西，我不想看到的东西，不想遇到的东西啊，然后呢没有办法的情况下，我遇到了，看到了等等啊，这个是第二个，这个我们生活当中处处都有这样子的痛苦。
The second type of suffering is that associated with having to encounter or experience things that we don't want to encounter or experience, and instances of this kind of suffering everywhere in our lives.
然后第三个就是我们离开不想离开的人，比如说自己的亲人、家人这样子。
The third kind of suffering when we have to part from people we don't wish to part from, such as our family members and so on.
第四个就是我们不想接触的不想接触的人不想在一起工作，不想在一起生活，不想在一起学习等等这样子的人然后就是往往要跟他接触跟他在一起生活等等这个就是第四个。
And the fourth kind of suffering is the suffering associated with having to be in the company of people we wish we didn't have to be in the company of. So having to study or work with people that we wish we didn't have to.
这8个就叫做人类的基本的痛苦。
So putting these kinds of suffering together, we have what is referred to as the 8 basic forms of human suffering.
我们每一个人的这个生活当中都会有的，这8个都会出现的。
So every single person within their lives will experience these 8 different kinds of suffering.
而且这8个在我们的生活当中随时随地都有可能出现。
And any of these forms of suffering could arise or manifest at any point in our lives and in any place.
那么我们接下来要给大家介绍当我们遇到这些问题的时候我们以什么样的心态去面对我们遇到这些问题的时候，我们应该怎么去看应该怎么去调整我们的心态接下来给大家介绍一下这个方法。
So what I'd like to talk a little bit now about is how we should go about confronting or approaching these kinds of suffering when they manifest in our lives. And I'd like to talk about a method that we can use for adopting a mindset conducive to addressing these kinds of suffering.
我今天要给大家讲3个方法。
So I'd like to talk about 3 methods that we can adopt today.
然后3个方法当中呢，其中2个是刚才你们的这个回答当中已经说到了。
And of these 3 methods, 2 of them were already raised in the answers that were given just now in respect to the spiritual life question.
首先第一个方法是刚才这位先生说的要接受，要面对现实这一个是非常重要的一个。
So the first method, which was mentioned by this gentleman here, was that when we encounter some kind of experience that we need to confront it and we need to accept it.
面对现实接受现状这个说起来是很容易的，但是呢这个很难做到。
Of course, to talk about accepting reality as it is a very easy thing to do, but in practice it's extremely difficult.
我们每个人都会说啊，我们要面对现实，要接受现状啊。但是呢，当我们遇到问题的时候呢，我们不会面对现实接受现状。这个时候我们一定会拒绝现实。
So everyone always talks about, oh yes, we should accept reality and all of that kind of thing. However, what happens is that when we do encounter some difficulty or suffering, we find ourselves rejecting reality.
比如说当我们生病的时候生病那么生病我们的身体这个生病了，那这就是一个现实，这个是所有人都会有的，是一个现实但是呢，我们没有人愿意我生病我们这个时候呢一定会拒绝所以我们一般的情况下，我们都不会面对现实的。
So, for example, when we are sick, our bodies are suffering. This is a fact. We are sick. However, nobody likes to be sick, and everyone tends to resist this state. So, in general, we don't tend to accept reality.
那么这个时候因为我们不面对现实，我们不接受这个痛苦然后我们用各种各样的方法去拒绝，尤其是我们的心理上拒绝我不应该生病，我为什么生病呢？等等等等然后就内心当中，比如说我自己的卫生比如说我这个生活这个不卫生不健康的生活，比如说吃的东西或者是熬夜等等。总而言之，就是因为这些不健康的这个生活的方式给我带来了这样子的这个病痛，然后呢特别的后悔内疚等等，就是心理上就去抗拒这个病我们不会拒绝，不会接受一直都在我们的心理上在这个拒绝。那么这个拒绝它导致了什么呢？导致了我们的这个病痛会更加的严重。
So when we do find ourselves being sick, then our minds come up with all manner of ways of resisting the reality of our sickness. Our minds ask, why is it that I'm sick? How is it that I'm sick? Was it due to my unhealthy lifestyle? Was it due to the food I eat or staying up late? And in mulling over the various reasons, we find ourselves in a state of regret and just overall resistance to the situation of our sickness. And what this leads to is a situation where our sickness brings us greater and more serious suffering.
然后尤其是我们的精神上的这个痛苦精神上的痛苦，所有的痛苦都是一样，精神上的痛苦我们越是拒绝越抗拒，然后我们的痛苦就会越来越增长越来越严重。
The same goes for any kind of suffering that we experience in our minds. The more that we resist the suffering associated with the problem will become increasingly serious.
然后身体上比如说身体上生病得了一个绝症像癌症等等这样子这个绝症这样子的时候呢，那很多人会说为什么是我呢为什么我得这样子的病呢得这个病的是为什么是我，为什么轮到我的头上呢很多人会这样子拒绝。
People who contract terminal illnesses, for example, in many cases will ask, why is it me? Why did this happen to me of all people? Why me?
然后这样子拒绝了以后呢，我们的心情就会更加的糟糕 就我觉得，比如说，因为大家都没有得病，大家都没有得这样子的病，为什么我一个人就得这样子的病呢？这不公平呢，不应该等等，这样子以后呢，我的心里就不能接受了，不能接受了以后呢，我内心的这个痛苦就会越来越增长越来越糟糕。
So, a person who is resisting the fact of their sickness will think things like, why me? Why has this happened to me? No one else is in this situation. No one else contracted this same illness. It's so unfair. It's so unjust. And the mind, not being able to accept the reality of the illness, will find that its state of suffering becomes increasingly worse.
然后就是因为我们的心情糟糕，越来越糟糕，最后这个我们的心也就影响到了这个身体影响到了身体，所以这个身体的这个疾病越来越恶化越来越恶化。
And as a result of our state of our minds becoming worse and worse, this then has a negative effect on our bodies, such that our physical ailment continues to deteriorate.
所以当我们遇到这样子的这个痛苦的时候呢首先我们要跟痛苦拥抱接受这个是最重要的第一步，这是最重要的一步。
So the very first step then that we have to take when we do encounter some form of suffering is to embrace it, to accept it. This is extremely important.
比如说我们生病的时候要去打针或者是吃药那么打针我们很多人不喜欢这个感觉然后呢吃药有些药也是这个味道这个药的味道我们很多人也不喜欢但是呢生病的时候呢我们会接受它的。
So when we get sick, sometimes we need an injection or we need to take some kind of medication. Of course, a lot of people don't like the feeling of getting an injection, and a lot of people don't like the taste of certain kinds of medicine. However, when we are in a state of illness, we are willing to accept doing these things.
那么这个时候我们虽然不喜欢打针，不喜欢这个药的这个味道我们都不喜欢，但是我们会接受那为什么你不喜欢？为什么要接受呢？我们就是喜欢这个药的作用它能给我治病我们就喜欢药的这个效果，而不是喜欢药的味道。
So why is it in this situation, given that we don't like the feeling of needles and that we don't like the taste of medicine, that we are willing to get injections or take medicine? And the reason is that what we do like or what we do desire is the function or the capacity of the medication, that is its curative capacity. So what we are actually appreciating is the result that the medication can bring us.
我们虽然不喜欢这个药的味道然后呢也不喜欢这个给自己动手术的这个感受不喜欢但是我们知道动了手术以后呢可以治病吃了这个药以后呢可以治病，对我的健康有帮助，所以我们可以这个接受接受的理由就是这样子。
Because we know that even though we don't obviously like the experience of having an operation, but because we know that the operation is able to cure us, because we know that a medication, a particular kind of medicine is able to restore our health, therefore we are willing to engage in these or to take these measures. We have a reason for accepting them.
同样的我们在生活当中遇到的这些痛苦，比如说我们的身体生病那么这个生病的这个感受我们不喜欢这个感受生病的这种感觉是一个我们大家都不喜欢的一个这样子的感受所以我们不喜欢它但是呢这个感受的后面这个背后有一个东西它可以帮助到我们从这个角度来看痛苦身体上的痛苦也是我们可以接受的。
So when we, in our everyday lives, when we experience suffering such as sickness, no one likes the feeling of sickness. However, behind that experience or feeling of sickness is something that is able to be of assistance to us. So on this basis, we can accept it.
精神上的也是一样，比如说离婚年轻人失恋、离婚或者是失业在这样子的时候或者是我们就是精神上受到了一些打击，那这样子的时候呢，我们会伤心的。那么这个伤心这种感觉是一个我们大家都不太喜欢的一个这样子的感受但是它的背后呢，也有一个东西是可以帮助到我们的。
And the same goes for other sorts of suffering in life. For example, the experience of falling out of love with someone, divorce, losing one's job, or other sorts of emotional injuries that we sustain. Nobody likes the feeling and the experience of hurt that is associated with these things. However, behind all of these experiences and behind this feeling of hurt, again, is something that can be of assistance to us.
那么背后的一个好的东西是什么呢？这个比如说我们的身体的痛苦精神的痛苦，这里面有一个东西呢，它是正面的。这个正面的东西能够让我们成长，它对我们的这个自我成长是有一定的帮助的。所以我们从这个角度看，那么痛苦是可以接受的。
And this positive thing or constructive thing that lies behind suffering is the capacity for this experience or feeling to assist us in our self-growth, in our personal growth. So for this reason, or we therefore have a reason for accepting the suffering.
但是我们的这个平时我们的这个思考是非常简单的很简单的。为什么这么说呢？就是因为这个痛苦生了病以后我们身体不舒服所以我不欢迎它所以我要拒绝。然后呢，我们的心里有这个伤心的时候呢，这个伤心的这个感觉是我们不喜欢的东西，所以我们就认为伤心我不要伤心，我不要这个不开心，我们会拒绝我们的想法就这么简单。
But usually the way that we think is extremely basic. It's extremely simplistic. Whenever we become sick or experience the suffering attendant with that, we don't welcome it, we resist it, we don't want it. The same with psychological suffering too. When we experience hurt or emotional injury, of course we don't like it, we don't want it, and we try to push it away.
如果我们这样子去思考的话这样子去思维的话，那么动手术我们也应该拒绝吃药我们也应该拒绝这些，因为这些都是我们不喜欢的东西所以这个比如说药的味道动手术的这个感觉这些都是我们不喜欢的。那么不喜欢的东西都拒绝的话这个我们也应该拒绝，但是我们没有拒绝。
If this was the basis of our logic, then by rights we should also reject operations. We should also reject taking medicine. If we essentially resist all of the things that we don't like and try to push them away, such as presumably that would include medicine that doesn't taste good and operations that don't feel good. That is, everything that we don't like we should push away and repel. But we don't always do this.
这个以上我们讲的是我们为什么要拥抱这个痛苦啊？为什么要这个接受痛苦的原因啊？理由。简单的说就是这样子，这是理由。
So in talking about the constructive potential of suffering, what I've just addressed is the reason that we should go about accepting suffering.
接下来我们再看看这个，那么痛苦它有什么好的东西啊？痛苦里面呢有什么东西是可以帮助到我们的？
So I'd like now to talk about the constructive or positive aspects of suffering and the capacity that suffering has to actually be of assistance to us.
首先第一个痛苦它能够让我们增长慈悲心。
The first thing is that suffering has the capacity to help us increase in our compassion.
然后痛苦能够让我们增长智慧。
It also has the capacity to help us increase our wisdom.
有痛苦的时候，我们可以做一些心灵的训练。
It's possible when we experience suffering to use it to train our minds.
这个训练没有痛苦的时候是没办法训练的，没办法做的。
And the kind of training that I'm talking about is the kind that we just simply can't engage in when we don't experience suffering.
然后通过这个训练，我们可以超越自我。
And it's possible by engaging in this training in the midst of suffering to transcend our ego.
所以任何一个事情，它有正和反的两面它有好的一面，有不好的一面任何一个事物都是这样子。痛苦也是就是有正面的，有负面的，所以我们看这个痛苦的正面就可以接受。
Any kind of phenomenon has a positive has its positive and negative aspects, and the same goes for suffering. Suffering has its positive and negative aspects too. So accepting that suffering does have positive dimensions, we therefore have a reason for accepting it.
然后这里面就是有一个很奇怪的这个现象是什么呢？当我们拒绝痛苦的时候它的力量就是越来越强当我们接受这个痛苦的时候呢，然后它的力量就越来越弱。
And indeed, there's a strange phenomenon. When we resist suffering, its power becomes greater and greater. However, when we start to accept suffering, the power that it has over us becomes weaker and weaker.
比如说我们得了一个绝症医院体检的时候查出来有癌症或者是有其他的比较严重的病那么这样子的时候呢，我们就是先接受没关系就这个病不是我一个人才得这个世界上有无数的人，有成千上万的人都会得这样子的病。过去是这样子，现在是这样子未来也有无数的人会得这样子的这个病这不是我一个人，没关系要这样子心胸敞开的去接受。
So if we were to find ourselves in hospital receiving a diagnosis of a terminal illness, for example, we could work to accept that illness on the basis that obviously it's not me I'm not the only person in the world who is in the experience who is contracted this illness. There are countless people in fact like myself, whether it be in the past or the present or the future, so I am not the only person to be in this situation.
然后还有一个就是当我们知道了我自己得了一种绝症这样子的时候呢，然后就是要去这么想好，这下子机会来了机会来了，我就通过这个疾病我要我要提升自己提升自己，然后就是通过这个疾病，我要训练自己要超越自我这些工作这些训练就在这样子的痛苦之下才能够完成才能够成功的做到否则的话我是做不到的。所以这一下子这个机会来了，所以我通过这个疾病我要做很多事情没关系就是要这么去接受然后这样子以后呢，一下子这个痛苦对我们的打击已经降到很低了。
So another very constructive approach that we can take is if, say, we're in a situation of being informed that we have contracted a very serious illness, we can think, great, finally my chance has arrived. Now I've really got an opportunity to work on myself, to train myself, to transcend my self-clinging. It's only when I'm in a state of suffering that I have the opportunity to do this work. Without this opportunity to experience suffering, I wouldn't be able to do it. So I'm going to use this instance of suffering in order to do this important work. And if we approach the situation in this way, then almost immediately the negative impact that it brings us is reduced significantly.
那么这个我们就始终就要保持一个比较乐观的这个心态乐观的心态，在人生当中生活当中，我们不管是遇到什么样的问题，就要用一个这样子的乐观的心态去面对。
So really the main thing is in life, regardless of where we are or what it throws up, that we maintain an optimistic attitude.
好，这个乐观它绝对不是一个盲目的乐观，而且它是一个非常积极的非常有智慧的乐观。
But the optimism that I'm speaking of is not a blind or deluded optimism. I'm really speaking about an optimism that is underpinned by real wisdom.
好，这是我们今天讲的3种方法当中的其中一个。
So what I have just spoken about now, the different attitudes that we can take in the face of suffering, is the first of the 3 methods that I am going to be talking about today.
就是面对现实，接受现状。
The method that I have just spoken of is confronting reality and accepting facts as they are.
释迦牟尼佛佛教他教我们怎么样去面对生活当中的各种各样的这个痛苦，而不是教我们怎么样去逃避。
What the Shakyamuni Buddha taught us was how to go about confronting all kinds of difficulties in life, not how to go about avoiding or evading them.
因为这个生活当中我们刚才讲的8种痛苦逃避是没有办法逃避的逃避没有办法逃避，谁也逃避不了我们每一个人都不想生病当我们会生病的然后我们每一个人都不想衰老，但是呢我们每一天的这个衰老 然后最后我们所有人都不想死亡，但是我们最后所有人都会死亡，所以这些逃避是没有办法逃避，只有去面对。
And the reason for this is that of the 8 different kinds of suffering that we mentioned, we're just simply not able to escape them. No one wants to get sick, and yet we all get sick. No one wants to get old, and yet we all will get old. And at the end of the day, nobody wants to die, but we all will end up dying. So given that it's not possible for us to escape these kinds of suffering, the only thing really left for us to do is simply to confront them.
释迦牟尼佛他发明了一个这个面对这些生活当中的这些各种各样的痛苦的一个方法他就发明了一个这样子的方法。那么我们现在用他的这个方法去面对生活当中的各种各样的这个痛苦这样子以后呢，这些痛苦虽然是不能逃避但是呢，它不会给我们带来太多的伤害和打击。
So what the Shakyamuni Buddha did was to invent a method for dealing with or confronting the various kinds of suffering in life. And if we are able to implement or employ this method, then even though there's no escape from these different forms of suffering, the pain that they bring us will be considerably less.
好，我们刚才讲的这些方法我们可以归纳为3句话，
And it's possible to sum up this method or approach in 3 sentences.
请大家记住第一句话就是当我们遇到这样子的精神和肉体上的这个痛苦的时候呢，然后我们敞开心胸去面对接受，这是第一句。
So the first sentence is that when we find ourselves encountering psychological or physical suffering, that we courageously go about accepting it.
第二句话，那么我们为什么要这个接受我们为什么接受痛苦呢？因为痛苦它也有好的一面所以我们这个时候呢，不要看痛苦的负面的不好的一面，就看它的好的一面这是如果我们这样子看那么就可以这个里面我们发现我们能够找到一些这个为什么要接受的理由第二句话就是理由为什么要接受的理由。
The second point, we might say, it's probably best to describe them as 3 points. The second point is to bear in mind the reason for accepting suffering, the justification for accepting suffering, and that is because, as we've just covered, that suffering does have its constructive side. It does have its positive aspects. So if we bear in mind these, then we are supplied with a reason for accepting the suffering.
第3句话那么我们看这个痛苦的好的一面那么实际上痛苦是真的是有好的一面，还是我们的一个自我安慰那这样子的话，实际上不是我们自我安慰，实际上痛苦它的感受它给我们的第一个感觉就是我们不太喜欢它，但是呢它的背后真的是有好东西所以这个不是我们的自我安慰实际上它有好的一面。
第3点
第3点
理由让理由自己也是属于理由是吧？
是理由嘛，就实际上它是有的不是自我安慰，实际上它有。
And the third point to keep in mind is having seen or accepted that suffering does have a positive function, that we should have conviction that this positive function is not just an idea, it's not just a way of comforting ourselves. We should have conviction in the fact that the positive benefits that suffering can bring us are real and substantive.
好，这个是我们今天要讲的这个3个方法当中的第一个。
So what we've really just been talking about is the attitude that we can take in the face of suffering. And this is the first method of addressing suffering that we're talking about today.
好，第一个方法呢，我们要落实到这个生活当中的话，那么在这个之前还需要一点点的这个训练那么这个训练呢，当我们还没有遇到这样子的这个问题还没有遇到这样子的痛苦的时候我们适当的去学习适当的去修心锻炼，这样子的话，到时候遇到问题的时候就很成功的就解决这个问题否则的话，我们平时不学习不训练，那这样子的话，遇到问题的时候理论上是我们知道的，但是呢，实际上做的不是很好。
Insofar as this approach is concerned, it's really important that prior to encountering a major form of suffering, that we do a bit of practice, that we do learning in relation to this kind of training. And if we're able to do some learning and practice in relation to accepting suffering in this way prior to encountering a major instance of suffering, then when we do, we will be able to accept it, and we'll be able to be successful in our approach. If in the ordinary course of events we know about this in theory, we accept it, etc., but we haven't practiced it, then when we encounter suffering, it won't be of much use.
接下来我们给大家介绍第二个方法。
And I'd now like to talk about the second method or approach that we can take.
第二个方法呢，刚才这位师兄提到了我们精神上需要什么回答的时候，就是说需要慈悲心那么第二个就是慈悲心。
The second approach or method was mentioned by this student here, who said in response to the question about what we need in our spiritual lives, that what we need is compassion.
比如说一个健康的人，当我们没有生病的时候，我们不太了解病人的痛苦。
So, for example, a healthy person, when we are in a state of good health, we don't have a particularly good understanding of the suffering of a person who is in ill health.
当我们的生活是一帆风顺的时候，我们体会不到这个生活不顺利就是有各种各样痛苦的人的感受。
And when our lives are smooth sailing, everything's going really well, we don't have much insight or understanding of those people for whom life is full of mishaps and misfortunes.
当我们有钱的时候我们不太感觉得到，不太体会得到这个贫穷的人的这种贫穷的感受。
And if we're very rich, very wealthy, then we similarly don't have much experience or insight into the suffering of people who are poor and deprived.
好，这样子以后呢，我们的身体健康有钱工作顺利，这样子的时候呢，我们不太在乎贫穷的人的感觉，然后呢，不太去想这个工作不顺利的人的感受不太去这个在乎不太在乎这个病人的病痛的 这个感觉啊，因为没有轮到我们自己的身上，所以我们都体会不到。
So when we are in a state of health, wealth, everything's going fine for us in our professional lives and whatever else, we really don't tend to think too much about the suffering of those who are poor or those who are experiencing misfortune or the nature of the suffering of people who are sick. It's not really until it happens to us, until it's our turn, that we really have a strong understanding or experience of what these kinds of suffering are like.
当我们不太了解或者是不太体会到这些社会的底层人的这个感受这样子的时候呢，我们很难有真正的这个慈悲心。
And when we are unable to, or until we've been able to gain a insight and understanding, deep understanding of the suffering of people in these marginal and difficult situations, then it's very difficult for us to have true compassion.
好，那么现在比如说我们自己生病了工作不顺利了或者是没钱了这样子的时候呢，我们机会来了我们通过自己的这个痛苦可以了解更多的人的这个痛苦，然后呢从中我们可以培养我们自己的这个慈悲心。
So because of this, when we do get sick or we find ourselves in a bad financial situation or our work isn't going well, then again we can see this as an opportunity. An opportunity has arrived and we can use the suffering that is associated with these different situations to gain in understanding and insight concerning about the suffering of others and thereby increase in our compassion.
好，这个时候我们自己生病的时候我们自己这个遇到问题的时候生活当中遇到各种各样的这个问题这样子的时候呢，那我们的正确的这个思维的方式是什么呢？这个时候我们应该想这下子比如说我生病了那么我发自内心的希望用我的这个病来代替天下所有人的这个病我发自内心的这个发愿只有我一个人生病其他人都不要生病所有人的这个病痛我一个人来这个代替要这么去想，这个就是正确的思维方式。
So in a situation where we get sick or we encounter problems in life, the proper or appropriate way for us to think is to make a very deep aspiration from the bottoms of our heart that I, in having this sickness, let me take on the suffering of all other people who are sick and suffering at the moment, and let my act of taking on their suffering mean that no other being has to experience the suffering. This is the proper way for us to think in such a situation.
刚才我们讲到了痛苦能让我们超越自我那什么叫做超越自我呢？平时我们的生活当中我们是这么认为的呢所有好的东西我要拥有所有的不好的东西我要给别人然后呢我不愿意去面对不好的东西让其他人去面对好的东西我要拥有这是我们的自私。那么现在通过这个病痛我们倒过来我宁可我生病不要其他人生病我的病痛我愿意代替所有人的病痛只有这个天下 只有我一个人生病，其他人都不要生病啊。那么以这样子的方式去超越自我。
So we spoke before of the capacity of suffering to enable us to transcend self-clinging. And how is it that this is possible? Well, generally, in terms of good and positive things, we want them all to happen to us. And negative things or bad things, we would prefer that other people confronted them. So we're generally rather selfish. However, by taking this approach, when we encounter the suffering of sickness, we reverse our habitual mode of thinking and instead aspire that me or ourselves, our own selves, rather be sick, that we take on the sickness of all others, take on the suffering of all others, so that they might not be sick, so that they might not undergo the suffering. So it's by engaging in this process that we have the potential to transcend our self-clinging.
然后有一个冥想的方法比如说我们比如说所有这个天下所有人的冰桶都变成了一个黑色的气体然后我吸气的时候呢把所有人的冰所有人的痛苦我吸过来从我的这个鼻孔吸过来，就是吸到我的身体里面。然后呢，我一个人生病，我一个人痛苦。那么这天下的所有的人都没有痛苦没有这个生病，他们都远离他们都离开了这个病痛的这个痛苦就是这样子冥想这是一个训练的一个方式，是一种冥想。
And there's a visualization that we can do when we're practicing in this way. We can visualize the suffering related to the illness of others as a black vapor. And when we breathe in, we can inhale this black vapor, the suffering of others. And in so doing, aspire that we ourselves be sick and in pain so that no one else is, and that our act of breathing in this black vapor, of breathing in their suffering, enables every single person in the world to be relieved of their own suffering. So this is a kind of training that we can do.
比如说我们举一个例子，今天我们这里有100个人100个人，那么如果这个100个人当中有一个人是一定要得病得一种很严重的病那么这样子以后呢，看谁愿意呢我们都会说我不要得病，每个人都说我不要得病，我不要这个病就是这样子这个我们平时我们的这个心灵的反应是这样子然后呢，有了这个慈悲心的时候呢，然后每个人都会说每个人都会站出来说我愿意我得病，其他的99个人都不健康给他们一个健康，我希望他们健康，就我一个人得病我来代替所有人的这个病就是这个如果有了慈悲心他就会这样子他就能够这个当中能够超越自己能够提升自己的这个慈悲心。
So if we... is the microphone working still? Oh. Yes? No? No. I will speak loudly then, yeah? So if there's 100 of us here today, and if it were the case that one of us must contract a dreadful illness, then in an ordinary situation, everyone would probably be saying, oh, not me, please don't let it be me. This is the way that we usually think. However, once we've cultivated our compassion, then our response is very different. Our response would then be to stand up and say, let it be me, let it be me, I will be the one who gets sick, so that the 99 other people here can be healthy. So cultivating our compassion, we both transcend our self-clinging and increase our compassion by training in this way.
这个是我们今天讲的第二个方法，非常的不容易，这个真的要做到的话，是不是很容易的？
So this is the second method or approach that we can take for dealing with suffering. It's not an easy one. It's a difficult one to put into practice.
所以这个我们现在没有生病的时候，没有遇到问题的时候呢，要学习，然后要训练这样子以后呢，到时候真正的遇到问题的时候就能够做得到。
And because of the fact that it's not easy, we really need to be starting to practice this right now when we are not in a state of grave illness or suffering, so that in the event that we do encounter this suffering, we're actually able to successfully use this method.
然后有了这样子的这个慈悲心的时候呢，自己的这个病痛也就是不会增加虽然是身体虽然是这个肉体它是有痛苦的但是呢，我们愿意接受了以后，还有就是有这样子的慈悲心的时候，这个强大的这个慈悲心，把肉体的这个痛苦也就压住了这样子我们几乎是感觉不到，所以这个肉体不会有很大的这个病痛的痛苦。
If we are able to practice this to adopt this kind of approach, then by the strength of powerful compassion, the pain or suffering that is associated with illness will not increase. The power of strong compassion will enable us to, for the pain associated with the illness to not become any more serious.
在大乘佛教里面有一个这个专门的这个训练的方法，这个就叫做自他相欢自他相欢，希望我们进一步的去了解、学习然后就平时就做一些这个锻炼。
Within the Mahayana teachings, there's a formal name for this practice. It's called Donglen, and it is the practice of exchanging self for other. And it would be wonderful if everybody learned more about this practice and also did this practice.
好，最后就是我们的第三个这个方法给大家介绍一下。
And finally, I'd like to talk about the third method that we can use for approaching suffering.
第三个方法呢，是一个大乘佛教里面的一个最高端的方法。
And the final method is the highest method within the Mahayana teachings for approaching suffering.
这个就是用到这个，比如说我们不开心的时候生气的时候难受的时候，心里难受的时候这些时候是非常非常管用的。
And this method is extremely effective. It's extremely useful in moments when we experience unhappiness or anger or other forms of psychological upset.
什么是痛苦什么是这个伤心什么是难过？实际上是我们的意识我们的意识，我们的心的一种感受就叫做这个难过、难受、痛苦。除了这个以外没有其他的痛苦和难受。
What is suffering? What is upset? What is sadness? What is depression? All of these are simply perceptions that arise in our consciousness.
我们就是当我们心里很难受的时候然后第一个不要去酗酒第二个就是不要用其他的方法，就用一个方法一个非常健康的一个方法可以用。
So with the exception, besides the perception in our consciousness, there is no independently existing sadness or anger or anything like this. So given this to be the case, when these perceptions arise in our consciousness, whether it be psychological upset or whatever, we shouldn't turn to the drink, but take a more healthy alternative.
那么这个最好的方法是什么呢？我们那个时候我们心里不高兴的时候生气的时候，首先找一个稍微比较安静的地方要坐下来。
So what we should do when these feelings do arise, the first thing to do is to locate a quiet place and sit down.
那么平时呢，我们不开心的时候我们会想这个人对我怎么不好那个人对我怎么不好这个人就是对我这个伤害我、侮辱我等等，我们会这么去想平时就是这样子。那么这样子以后呢，我们的这个难受、难过，或者是我们的这个烦恼就会越来越增长。
Ordinarily, when we find ourselves feeling upset, the first thing we start to do is blame others and say, oh, that person did this to me and that person did that to me, they hurt me, they insulted me, etc. And as a result, our sense of mental or emotional affliction just increases.
那么这个时候呢，我们不要往外面去想这个人对我不好，那个人对我，不要外面去，往里边去看，我到底什么是伤心到底什么是难过，到底什么是生气往里面去看一看，去了解一下，往自己的心里。
So in these moments, what we should do is, rather than turning to external sources and seek to find blame in external sources, we should turn inwards to ourselves and ask of ourselves, what is suffering? What is upset? What is sadness? What is the nature of anger?
这个时候呢，一定会发生一个奇迹。
And if we're able to do this, we will necessarily encounter something miraculous.
这奇迹是什么呢？比如说我们的难受我们的生气，我们没有去关注它的时候呢，它就会越来越强大，越来越这个增长。然后我们去关注它的时候关注它的本身的时候，本体的时候呢，然后它就会往里面收缩它就不会发展它会越来越小，甚至它会消失。
And what we discover is that when we fail to turn our attention to the essence of a negative emotion, they continue to grow and increase in their extremity or their severity. However, when we actually turn our attention to examining the fundamental nature of this perception or emotion, we find that the perception shrinks, it ceases to grow, and it even may possibly disappear.
比较轻微的这个伤心、难过和生气它不需要任何其他的方法，就是关注一下它自己它立即就会消失的。
So, relatively mild forms of psychological upset, anger, sadness, etc., they really don't require us to do anything more than to turn our minds to examining their nature, and of their own accord, they'll disappear.
然后我们还要可以这样子就是静下来我们看这个难过生气的这个念头它是来自于什么当它诞生的时候当它出现的时候，它来自于什么首先看它的源头是什么，它是从哪里来的这个时候我们会发现它是没有来源，没有源头。
And what we can do is turn our attention to examining the origin of this particular kind of negative thought. The negative thought, where did it arise from? What was its origin? What was its beginning? And if we examine the thought in this way, we will discover that in fact it doesn't have an origin. It didn't come from anywhere.
然后我们看这个念头消失的时候它消失于什么地方它消失在什么地方？什么地方消失了观察一下，然后我们会发现它没有一个消失的地方它也没有一个诞生的地方，它也没有一个消失的地方在佛教里面，这个就叫做无来无去。
And similarly, we can observe the thought. Where does it, when it disappears, when it fades, where does it fade into? What is the place that it fades into? And in observing in this way, we will discover that there is no place that it dissolves into. So, on the one hand, the thought arises from nowhere and it also dissolves into nowhere. So, we talk about this in Buddhist language as no arising and no ceasing.
那么这个时候我们会发现原来它就像一个清风一样轻轻的风吹过来了，抚摸了我们的身体，然后它就走了走了以后就是无影无踪。
And in observing in this way, the thought will appear to us just like a gentle breeze that blows over our body, ruffles us a little bit, and then departs.
然后我们也会发现它就像天上的一朵云一朵云从东边出来往西边走走完了以后呢，它实际上就是一个过客走完了以后呢。也没有什么没有留下什么，就是无影无踪，最后它还是无影无踪。
And we can liken the thought also to a cloud that moves from the east of the sky to the west. It's just like a traveler moving through the sky. It leaves nothing behind us. It's completely traceless.
这个就是当你发现它是无影无踪，它就是只不过就是一个过客这样子的时候呢，这就叫做智慧。我们用慧眼看烦恼，发现了这个烦恼的本质然后就增长了我们的智慧。
So in discovering this, in discovering that these negative thoughts are just like a passing traveler, are completely traceless and leave nothing in their wake, what we do is generate wisdom. We generate the wisdom of recognizing the essence of delusion.
但是这个我们今天讲的最后一个方法，我们需要一点这个佛教的基础有一点基础才可以用得上没有基础从零开始的这个人可能是暂时是用不上的但是呢我们也可以通过这种方法去训练。
So this third method for approaching suffering or confronting suffering that I've just spoken about is one that we need some foundation in Buddhist practice in order to really be able to implement. It's one that will probably be too difficult for people who are just starting out in their Buddhist practice. However, it is one that we can effectively employ.
好，这样子以后呢，我们每一天在生活当中遇到的每一个烦恼，每一个不开心，我们可以通过这3种方法，把它们转化为一个开心、幸福，这个乐观可以把它变成这样子。
So the 3 methods that I've introduced this afternoon can all be appropriated in our everyday lives when we encounter sufferings in different forms, so that we can transform these experiences of suffering into happiness and states of optimism.
如果我们把这3种方法用得比较好，这样子的话，那我们的内心会越来越强大，越来越强大。那么我们的内心越来越强大以后呢，不管是在外面发生了什么样的事情它都不会影响到我们的内心从此以后呢，可以过一个非常这个积极的非常乐观的、非常开心的这样子的生活。
So if we're able to implement these approaches successfully in our lives, then this will lead to us having stronger minds. And in having stronger minds, regardless of what transpires in the external world, it won't have the capacity to have a strong negative impact on our states of mind. And from this point in time, we can really go about living lives that are happy, meaningful, and optimistic.
今天我们给大家介绍的这个3个方法，它还有每一个方法都有一些很具体、非常非常具体的方法。那么这些具体的方法，大家想了解的话，那我们需要进一步的去学习，进一步的去修心和锻炼。
So in respect of the 3 methods that I've introduced today, each of them has its own associated, very detailed instructions for how to go about putting them into practice. So in terms of the practice of these 3 methods, we really need to continue with learning more about their content and learning more about their practice.
今天的我们的这个讲课到此结束了非常感谢大家。
Thank you very much to everyone.
Thank you very much.